Hi guys, this is Dr. Jimenez and welcome to the primer on communities. And what I wanted to do with this video is really give you a bit of a foundation in terms of the different types of communities that exist. There's various different types of learning communities, but I thought it's important for us to at least have a decent foundation in terms of some of the best practices that you'll be reading about in the article later this week. So, to kind of sum it up for you in very simple and easy to understand terms. I'm just going to move on to the next slide here. Sorry about that. There we go. So I just want to start off with a very brief definition of what a community is in its most simplest and basic form, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what it means from an academic perspective. So if you look at the standard definition, this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. You'll find it also similar definition at dictionary.com and any other online dictionary you can find out there. But basically, a community for us is really any social group of any size whose members reside in a specific locality. They may share the same government, often have some sort of common cultural or historical heritage. So community in its most simplest form is pretty much if you live in a town, that's your community. If you live in a block, that's your community. If you go to school, that's your community, right? You can be part of multiple different communities. And if you look at the other definitions here, a locality inhabited by a group. It could be social, it could be religious, it could be occupational. So basically, wherever you go, you are potentially forming a community. At work, you form a community. There might be sub-communities that are formed at work. If you go to houses of worship, you're forming a community. Community is really, any kind of group that comes together for some sort of cause, belief, or some sort of quote-unquote, again, shared interest. So if we think about communities from that very basic perspective, well, what does it mean, though, when we talk about learning communities? And learning communities, as we'll learn, really exist across a spectrum. There's a variety of different kinds of learning communities that exist. But when we go back and think about communities in its most simplest form, Love and Wenger, who are, for lack of a better word, giants in the concept of, in this case, situated learning, and Wenger, who definitely has a name for himself when it comes to the concepts of communities of practice. When you go back to some of the earliest definitions of how they view communities, and specifically here, communities imply that there is some sort of participation that's happening within a given activity or an activity system. And for lack of a better word, there is some sort of shared understanding, shared motivation that is based on what they're doing and what it means in their lives and in their communities. So there's a shared interest, right? This definition coincides with the most basic fundamental definition, but one of the things that it doesn't imply is it doesn't necessarily mean there has to be a co-presence or a well-defined identifiable group or any kind of social visible boundaries. It can be virtual. And in our case, that's what we're interested in, online communities. How do we form online communities within a quote-unquote distance course? Now, if you think about these definitions of communities, right, when you think about it, our classroom is a community, and we have a shared interest in the fact that we're all learning about distance learning. You all are professionals in your fields who have taken this course, whether it's because it's part of your graduation requirement, one or two, you may be taking it as a extra. Either way, this grouping that we have together is a community, and it satisfies the definitions that are provided by Love and Wenger. But when you start to look at some of the other research, especially around Correa and Davis, they talk a little bit about the four types of learning communities that exist. And ultimately, if you look at this diagram from the bottom to the top and from left to right, basically the most basic and simplest form, I'm just going to bring up the pointer here, the most basic and simplest form of a community is what's called a community of interest. This is typically the most basic and foundational learning type of community because people come together because there's some sort of interest. And we'll talk about the formal definition of each of these in a moment. But ultimately, there's a spectrum. And the higher that you go in the spectrum, the more cohesive the group. The greater you go from left to right, the stronger the level of intentionality. So there's a common reason, a goal, a motivation to be involved. But ultimately, where you want to drive people to when you create community is you want them to move towards a community of practice, because this is, in many ways, the most cohesive, the most socially strong of all the different communities. So ultimately, we want to become a learning community of practice. But the question may be in some of your minds, well, that's great. Well, what about these other communities? Is there such a thing as a bad community, a good community? Well, for our purposes, what I will say is that if you look at the most basic definition and the most basic form of a community of interest, this is the most basic type of community. And by the way, all four of these communities are learning communities because there's some sort of learning that's happening at some level, right? The community of interest, which is the most basic type of community, deals with members who come together for a specific topic, which is why it's called a community of interest. They're here for a reason. There's an interest in the community. Now, there could be, for example, Facebook groups, that's what I'm trying to say. Facebook groups that come together because they have an interest in ed tech. Or there could be, groups that form in LinkedIn or other social media, right? You can have groups that form that are part of, let's say, an interest in terms of educational best practices, high school, STEM. The point is, just by forming these groups, they come together because there's some sort of interest, but usually there's minimal social connectivity, there's minimal intentionality. It could just be a group that comes together. Maybe they have a shared resource of some kind in a very high-level way. It could be just a simple website, a wiki, that sort of thing. The next type of community is goal-oriented community of interest. Now, this takes up the concept of a community up a notch, where members come together around a topic, but they have a specific outcome that they are looking to achieve within a particular time frame. So maybe they are joining a community because they want to learn about a particular topic, and they know that they're going to have to learn it between now and the next 2 months, or the next 3 months, or 4 months, or maybe it's part of a course that they're taking, right? So goal-oriented communities of interest are typically time-driven. So therefore, there's some sort of finite beginning, middle, and end that has to be met, and they're going to get something out of it. They're going to learn a topic, right? And it doesn't have to be a course, right? There could be maybe a series of videos on Adobe products. Maybe it's on the Google suite of tools. These communities, again, they're more time-based than some of the others. Now this is in comparison to the third type, which is what's called a learner's community, sometimes also referred to as a learner's community. And this community really focuses on not only students, but it focuses in institutional context. So these are students, could be, lifelong learners, who depend on some sort of moderator, some sort of instructor for guidance. And that instructor or that leader of the group, is providing them with some sort of guidance. These kind of groups tend to have higher social bonds and connectivity and greater levels of I would say, intentionality when it comes to meeting together. So maybe they offer a monthly webinar or a quarterly session for their members to meet and share ideas, right? But ultimately, all of these are building up to what I think of the penultimate type of community that you want to build, whether it's an online environment or otherwise, and that is a community of practice, sometimes referred to in some of the literature as a learning community of practice. And the difference here is that the community of practice doesn't look at the individual members as students or as members, but it looks at them as professionals. You are all professionals in your field, in your area of study, and you perform, for the most part, similar activities. So you have similar interests, similar goals, similar objectives, and these groups, because of the nature of what makes a community of practice, because there's a lot of sharing that happens, sharing of knowledge, tools, resources, best practices, and because of that, there's a greater social bond and a greater level of intentionality of meeting. In other words, there's greater motivation in many ways. Now, this is important to understand because when you look at some of the further definitions of learning communities of practice, which again is the penultimate of what we want to form when it comes to forming communities in the online environment, these are people who see themselves as having, they're not just professionals, they have a passion for what they do. So if you think about it, each and every single one of you in this course has a passion for learning, a passion to be better educators in whatever field or scope that you're in, right? Whether you're teaching a class, whether you're leading PD sessions, whether you are looking to one day lead your own class, or whatever other type of educational setting that you work in, each of you is a professional. And therefore, each of you brings that interest. There's an interest in being part of this group. There's a passion that's there. And that informs how you interact with the rest of the group. More importantly, these members in a learning community of practice develop what's called a shared repertoire of sources. And again, these best practices, which is why it's a learning community of practice. The practice is that you're sharing these ideas, these concepts, these tools, these resources with each other. And if you think about it, in many ways, you as a group have been sharing best practices, tools, stories, ideas. These things form the foundation of what could be defined as a learning community of practice. The one thing to consider is that learning communities of practice don't happen overnight. It takes time. And over time, the formation of a learning community of practice emerges. So if you think of it from its most basic foundational level, hopefully, over time, we've been building towards becoming more of a learning community of practice because now, by this point in time, most of you, all of you, hopefully should be comfortable with each other. You're sharing your best practices. You're sharing your opinions and thoughts. And that's what a learning community of practice is all about. Because again, that type of bond helps to not only create a stronger bond among the members, it also increases the potential of social presence among all its members because people know, hey, someone's there, someone's active, someone's going to respond to my question or to my thought or idea, which means there's greater opportunities to share information and there is greater interaction among the members in a variety of different ways. So there's a lot of benefits in forming communities, which ties back nicely as well, not only to community building, but also to active learning strategies as well, which you're going to be reading about in your other paper this week. So with that, hopefully this gives you at least a very cursory foundational understanding of communities and why it's important for us to understand how communities can help us in driving the learning process. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.